In the winter of 385, a bishop in northeastern Spain broke the seal on a letter he had been waiting almost a year to read. His name was Hymerius. He was Bishop of Tarragona, a Roman port city on the Mediterranean coast, and months earlier he had sent a list of questions to Rome. Practical questions. The kind a working bishop asks when the rulebook has gone quiet and the problems have not. Damasus, the pope he wrote to, died before he could answer. So the reply came from Damasus's successor, a Roman named Siricius, and it survives. Historians call it Directa, after its opening word. It is commonly described as the earliest papal decretal preserved in full, though a letter to the bishops of Gaul may be older and its authorship is disputed. It reads less like a meditation and more like an audit. Buried in the middle of it is the question Hymerius seems to have found difficult to put on paper. What am I supposed to do about the priests who keep having children? Not concubines, not scandals. Children, born to wives these men had married lawfully, in public, years before anyone laid a hand on their heads. Almost nobody notices what Siricius actually said back. He did not tell Hymerius to stop ordaining married men. He did not say the church had erred by putting husbands at the altar. He told Hymerius that men already ordained were bound to stop sleeping with the wives they already had, and he insisted without argument or apology that this was not a new rule. It was an old one, going back to the beginning. The Spanish priests, it seems, had a defense ready. They pointed to the priests of Israel. Aaron had sons. The Levites had wives. Why shouldn't they? Siricius was unmoved. Read that exchange again because it does not say what almost everyone assumes it says. The argument was never about marriage. It was about the marriage bed. Everything that follows in this story turns on that sentence. Constantinople, Rome, an emperor's law code, a council held under a dome, a schism, a reformation, and a Belgian bishop who made international news 4 months ago. All of it sits on a distinction that modern English has flattened into a single word. Celibacy comes from the Latin celibatus, from calebs, which means simply unmarried. That is the whole meaning. It carries no moral freight of its own. A Roman bachelor was celebs, and the empire taxed him for it. Continence is the second word. It means abstaining from sexual relations, and it says nothing whatsoever about whether you have a wife. Those two things come apart easily. A man can be married and continent. A man can be unmarried and thoroughly incontinent. The 4th century church understood the difference and legislated on it with real precision. We inherited its vocabulary and lost its distinctions. So let me put my position on the table early, because it cuts against both of the stories you have probably been handed. Rome did not invent clerical celibacy in the Middle Ages to stop priests' sons from inheriting church land. And the Christian East did not simply preserve unchanged what the apostles handed down. Both churches inherited the same demand, that the man who handles the altar keeps away from the bed, and both of them broke it, in opposite directions. The East relaxed the rule and kept the married priest. The West kept the rule and removed the wife. That claim is contested. I am going to show you where the evidence is strong and where it thins into educated guessing, because this is a subject on which serious scholars disagree and nobody lands a knockout. Start where the argument always starts, and where it settles least. Peter was married, not probably, not arguably, married. Mark 1 verse 30 has Jesus healing his mother-in-law, and a mother-in-law implies a wife. Paul knows this and uses it. In 1 Corinthians 9 verse 5, defending his rights as an apostle, he asks whether he and Barnabas alone lacked the freedom to be accompanied by a believing wife, as the other apostles do, and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. Cephas is Peter. Paul names him specifically. Then there are the 2 verses that have carried more weight in this argument than any others. In 1 Timothy 3 verse 2, the overseer must be, in the King James phrasing, the husband of one wife. Titus 1 verse 6 says the same of elders. The Greek is worth slowing down for, because the English hides the strangeness of it. The phrase is maios gynaikos andra. Maios means of one. Gynaikos means of a woman or of a wife. Greek uses the same word for both, and context decides. Andra means man or husband, and the same ambiguity applies. So the phrase is not a sentence. It is a compressed description, a one-woman man. And the word order throws the stress onto the one. What the phrase requires has been argued for 18 centuries. 4 readings compete. The first takes it as a demand for marital fidelity. A leader is a man devoted to one woman, whatever else is true of his history. This is the reading most modern commentators favor, and I think it is the most natural one. The second takes it as a prohibition of polygamy, which existed at the edges of the ancient Mediterranean world and would have been a live pastoral question. The third takes it as a ban on remarriage. married once and once only, so that a widower who remarried was disqualified. This reading has ancient support and shaped Eastern practice permanently, as we will see. The fourth is the one you will almost never hear on this subject, and it is the load-bearing one for the argument this whole episode is about. On this reading, the phrase is a technical formula. The Church ordained mature married men on the understanding that from ordination onward they would live in perfect continence with the wives they already had, married once, and after that, no longer sleeping with her. That fourth reading was developed by the Belgian scholar Ignace de la Poterie and taken up by a cluster of researchers including Christian Coccini, Alphonse Stickler, Stefan Hyde, and Roman Colli. It is a minority position among biblical scholars generally, and I want to label it as such. Here is my first opinion, and I will hold it lightly. I do not think the phrase means that. I think the continence reading is a later practice being read backwards into an earlier text, a habit every tradition indulges, including mine, including yours. What I will not do is pretend the Christian scriptures settle the question the other way either. They do not, because the same Paul who defends the right of apostles to travel with wives also writes 1 Corinthians 7 verse 7, wishing that everyone were as he is, unmarried, and then immediately conceding that each has his own gift. The same Jesus who blesses marriage says, in Matthew 19 verse 12, that some make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and that whoever can accept this should. Scripture prefers the unmarried state for ministry and assumes married clergy in the same breath. It commends celibacy and never commands it. Anyone who tells you the Bible closes this case has read half of it. So if the texts do not produce the rule, what did? The answer is a piece of religious logic so old it predates Christianity, and it is the part of this story that almost no modern defender of celibacy wants to say out loud. Turn to Luke 1 verse 5. The Gospel introduces Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, as a priest of the division of Abijah. That is not decorative detail. Israel's priesthood was organized into 24 rotating courses, and each course served in the temple for a set period before going home to ordinary life. Priesthood in that system was shift work. Now put that beside Leviticus 15 verse 18, which declares a man and woman ritually unclean until evening after sexual relations. Put it beside Exodus 19 verse 15, where Moses prepares Israel to meet God at Sinai and tells the men not to go near a woman. Put it beside 1 Samuel 21 verse 4-5, where the priest Ahimelech will only hand David the consecrated bread once he has established that David's young men have kept themselves from women. None of that describes lifelong abstinence. All of it describes temporary abstinence attached to a specific act of approach. You are about to come near the holy. Prepare. Then go home. Here is the analogy I would use, and it is the one that made this click for me. Imagine a lighthouse where the lamp is lit 3 nights a year, for storms. The rule for the keeper is simple. While the lamp burns, no drink. It is a rule about a night. The keeper has a life, and the rule visits it occasionally. Now imagine someone lights the lamp permanently. Not a single word of the rule has changed, but it has stopped being a rule about a night and become a rule about a life. And the keeper, who signed up for one thing, is now living inside another. That is what happened to the Christian priesthood. As the Eucharist moved from an occasional communal meal toward frequent, and in parts of the West, daily celebration, and as the language describing its ministers shifted from presbyteros, meaning elder, toward the vocabulary of sacrifice and priesthood, the old purity logic quietly changed shape. A rule about the day of service became a rule about every day. Periodic abstinence became permanent abstinence. The lamp never went out. This connection is not my invention. Stefan Hyde, who is broadly sympathetic to the ancient origins case, frames the divergence exactly this way. In the West, daily Eucharistic celebration pushed toward complete continence, while in the East, less frequent celebration allowed a married clergy with periodic abstinence to survive. And this is where the scholarly fight lives. On one side, Roger Grison and those following him argue that for the first 3 centuries most clergy lived ordinary married lives, and that the continence rule is a 4th century product of rising asceticism combined with the sacralizing of church office. On the other side, Coccini, Stickler, Hyde and Cholich argue that the 4th century laws presuppose an unwritten apostolic practice, and that legislation appeared only when the practice began failing. The honest summary is that both are reconstructions. There is no written apostolic instruction requiring clerical continence. Everyone concedes that. The disagreement is about what silence means. My second opinion, and this one I hold firmly, the ritual purity engine is the real historical driver, and it is the part of the tradition that modern defenders have quietly abandoned. Because owning it means saying out loud, that the marriage act renders a man temporarily unfit to touch the altar. Ambrose said something close to it. Jerome went considerably further. Very few would say it now. The modern Catholic case for celibacy has been rebuilt on different ground: availability, undivided attention, a visible sign pointing beyond this world, and I think that rebuilding is theologically healthier and historically less candid than it usually admits. Now to the century where the paper trail begins. Around 305, in a Spanish town the Romans called Illaberis, near modern Granada, 19 bishops and a body of priests met and issued 81 disciplinary canons. We call it the Council of Elvira. Its date is uncertain. Estimates run from about 300 to 309. Canon 33 is the oldest surviving legislation on clerical continence anywhere in the Christian world. It forbids bishops, priests, deacons, and all clerics in active ministry from relations with their wives and from fathering children, on pain of removal from the clergy. Notice what it does not do. It does not forbid clergy from being married. It does not forbid ordaining married men. It targets one thing only. Notice also the trouble underneath it. A canon that has to say stop fathering children exists because clergy were fathering children. Law is written against behavior, not against theory. There is a complication here that defenders of the ancient origins case tend to skate past. The French scholar M. Maine and Grayson after him argued that the Elvira canons are a composite collection assembled across the 4th century, and that only the first 21 belong to the original meeting, which would place Canon 33 near the end of the 4th century rather than the beginning. That reading is disputed, but it is serious, and it removes the earliest data point from the apostolic argument. I flag it because the popular version of this story never does. 20 years later came Nicaea in 325, and here we arrive at the single most repeated claim in every argument about clerical celibacy on the internet. The story goes like this. The bishops at Nicaea were prepared to impose the Elvira rule on the whole church. A one-eyed Egyptian bishop named Paphnutius, a confessor who had been mutilated and sent to the mines under the Emperor Maximinus, and who was himself unmarried, rose and begged them not to. He argued that the marriage bed is honourable, and that the burden would be too heavy. The council listened and dropped it. It is a wonderful story. I want it to be true. The evidence is thinner than the enthusiasm. The account appears in Socrates Scholasticus, writing around 440, over a century after the council, and again in Sermon. It is absent from Athanasius, who was at Nicaea. Rufinus describes Paphnutius at some length and says nothing about the celibacy debate. The name is missing from some lists of Egyptian bishops present. In 1968, the historian Friedrich Winkelmann argued that the figure may not be historical at all. On the other side, Karl Joseph von Hefele defended the account in 1855, and Franz Xaver von Funk, Elphege Vacandard, and Henri Leclerc followed him. It is not a settled question. My third opinion. The Paphnutius story is too late and too convenient to bear the weight either side puts on it, and any argument that leans on it is standing on a floorboard nobody has tested. Treat it as disputed. Do not build on it. What Nicaea certainly did produce is Canon 3, which forbids any cleric to keep a woman in his household except a mother, sister, aunt, or a person beyond suspicion. Cuccini reads that last category as covering wives who had already committed to continence. That is an interpretation, not a fact, and I would not stake anything on it. The rest of the 4th century is unambiguous about the direction of travel in the West. Siricius wrote Directa in 385 and followed it with a second letter to the African bishops the next year. A synod at Carthage around 390 required that bishops, priests, and deacons abstain from relations with their wives, so that those serving the altar might keep perfect chastity. Innocent I wrote in the same vein. Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine all treat continent clergy as the standard. And something strange grows up around this rule in the Latin West, which I find more revealing than any of the canons. The wife did not disappear, she stayed. In Gaul she acquired a title of her own, presbytera if her husband was a priest, diaconissa if a deacon, even episcopia if a bishop. Councils at Arles, Orange, and Tours across the 5th and 6th centuries dealt with her status directly. At Orange, in 441 we get the first explicit requirement of a public declaration of the commitment to continence, apparently so that nobody could later plead ignorance of what ordination cost. Picture the household that produces. A married couple, sharing a roof, raising the children they already had, publicly pledged never to share a bed again, with the wife holding a formal ecclesiastical title derived from her husband's office. That is the West's original solution, not celibacy, a continent marriage lived in the open under supervision. It lasted about 700 years, and it failed. Before we get to how it failed, follow the other half of Christendom, because the East is where the first decisive break happens. And it happens earlier than most people think. The Emperor Justinian reigned from 527 to 565, and he legislated on the Church with the confidence of a man who considered it part of his administration. In the sixth of his new laws, issued in 535, he ruled that bishops should be drawn preferably from unmarried clerics and monks, and that a married but childless man raised to the episcopate must live apart from his wife. He had already barred men with children from becoming bishops. His stated reason deserves attention because it is the argument everyone thinks was invented in medieval Rome. Justinian wanted bishops free of family obligations so they could devote themselves to the Church. And, explicitly, he wanted the faithful to be confident that their donations would not end up enriching a bishop's heirs. Church property, inheritance, alienation of assets to sons. That argument is real, and it is genuine history. It is just Byzantine, imperial, and 600 years earlier than where the popular version files it. In 546, Justinian added that no deacon or priest could marry after ordination, on pain of expulsion from the clergy. Suitable married men could still be ordained. The window opened before ordination and shut permanently afterward. Then comes the council that changes everything. In 691, the Emperor Justinian II summoned a gathering to the domed hall of the imperial palace in Constantinople. Roughly 211 bishops attended, almost all Greek-speaking. It sat into 692, because it was called to supply the disciplinary canons that the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils had never issued. It is known as the Quinisext Council, the Fifth-Sixth, or simply the Council in Trullo, after the Dome. Its canons rearranged the Eastern priesthood permanently. Canon 6 confirmed that no one in major orders may marry after ordination. Canon 12 required that bishops live separated from their wives. Canon 48 spelled out the mechanics with a coldness. That still lands. The wife of a man raised to the episcopate is to be separated from him by mutual consent, and after his consecration she is to enter a monastery located at a distance from his residence, supported at his expense, and if judged worthy she may be made a deaconess. Then Canon 13, which is the hinge of this entire episode. Canon 13 names the Roman practice. It says the Romans require continence of priests and deacons after ordination, declares the Eastern churches will hold to what it calls the apostolic norm, and rules that priests and deacons may keep conjugal life with their wives. It also forbids Eastern clergy to dismiss their wives under pretext of religion. But read the whole canon, because there is a clause that gets dropped from every summary I have ever seen. Trullo still required abstinence at the times of service at the altar, which means the East did not reject the purity logic. It preserved it and made it periodic. The lamp was allowed to go dark again. That is why I said at the start that both churches broke the same inheritance. The East kept the married priesthood by restoring a rhythm the West had abolished. The West kept the abolition and eventually abolished the wife too. Pope Siricius I refused to sign the Trullan canons. A century later, Hadrian I gave them a qualified recognition, and the precise status of Trullo in Western canon law has been argued about ever since. Label that as disputed. The scholarship is not tidy. Two further things about Trullo deserve saying plainly, because they complicate the account you will hear in most Orthodox parishes. The first is that Canon 48 is not a merciful provision. A woman whose husband is elected bishop is separated from him and sent to a monastery at a distance. The marriage continues in law and ends in every other sense. When the East had to choose between the altar and the bed, it chose the altar too. It simply chose at a different rank. The second is chronological. The Orthodox rule that bishops must be celibate is not apostolic in any demonstrable sense. It takes its recognizable form under Justinian in the 6th century, and is fixed at Trullo in the 7th. Even sympathetic Orthodox writers acknowledge the requirement that bishops be monastics developed later still. This is a discipline with a history, not a revelation with a date stamp. Now back west, where the story gets uglier before it gets clearer. From the 7th century to the 10th, the Western rule was law on paper and fiction in practice across much of Europe. Priests lived with their wives. Priests' sons expected to inherit their father's churches. Benefices, the income attached to a parish or office, were treated as family property in large parts of Christendom. That is the actual crisis that produced the medieval reform. Not lust, inheritance. The reformers had a name for the whole complex, borrowed from Revelation and applied with considerable polemical violence. Nicolaitism, meaning clerical marriage and concubinage taken together. Peter Damian, who lived from roughly 1007 to 1072, campaigned against it in language that makes uncomfortable reading today. Pope Nicholas II convened a Lateran synod in 1059 that instructed the laity not to attend the masses of clergy living with women. A startling move, since it enlisted ordinary Christians as enforcement. Then Gregory VII, Pope from 1073 to 1085, made it the center of a program. His Synod of 1074 required clerics to commit to continence, and repeated the boycott of unchaste priests' masses. His Synod of 1078 put the burden of enforcement on bishops and threatened to suspend those who tolerated offenders. The reform was inseparable from Gregory's larger war over lay investiture, over whether kings or the church appointed bishops. A clergy with wives and heirs is a clergy embedded in local family networks, and a clergy embedded in family networks is a clergy that belongs to the nobility rather than to Rome. So yes, property and power are in this story. Anyone who denies it is not reading the sources. But notice what the property motive explains and what it does not. It explains the ferocity of the 11th century enforcement. It does not explain the rule, which was already 700 years old and had been articulated in a Spanish canon and a papal letter, long before anyone in Rome had a feudal problem. The First Lateran Council met in 1123. The Second Lateran Council met in April of 1139, convened by Innocent II, with several hundred prelates present. Its sixth canon stripped office and benefice from those in subdeacons' orders and above who had taken wives or concubines. Its seventh canon renewed the boycott and pushed further into the territory. That would prove decisive. Historians differ over exactly which council first made holy orders a diriment impediment, an obstacle that renders a marriage not merely illicit, but void. Some credit the First Lateran, some the Second, and some argue the decisive work was done by the canonists interpreting them afterward. I would treat the precise attribution as unsettled. The practical outcome is not unsettled. By the middle of the 12th century, in Western canon law, a man in major orders could not contract a valid marriage at all. Not a forbidden marriage, not a marriage. And a married man could no longer be ordained. That is the moment continence became celibacy. Here is my fourth opinion, and it is the one I would most want you to argue with. The West did not switch to celibacy because it decided marriage was worse than it had previously thought. The West switched to celibacy because continence inside a marriage cannot be verified, and celibacy can. You cannot audit a bedroom, you can audit a household. A rule that depends entirely on the private honesty of thousands of men, sustained across generations. In a culture where a priest's son could expect to inherit the parish is not a rule, it is a hope. What the 12th century did was replace an unenforceable promise with an enforceable status. Celibacy is what you get when you demand continence and cannot check. The Council of Trent reaffirmed the discipline in 1563 in the middle of the Reformation, and by then the question had become a doctrinal flag rather than a disciplinary one. Martin Luther married Katharina von Bora, a former nun, in June of 1525, and the marriage was itself an argument. Clerical marriage stopped being a practice under negotiation and became a border between churches. Which brings us to the part where nearly everything the internet tells you about the present is wrong in some precise, correctable way. Begin with the sentence in this video's title, which I chose deliberately because it contains an error almost everyone repeats. Orthodox priests do not marry. Married men become priests. The distinction is not pedantry, it is the entire architecture. A man who wants to serve as a married Orthodox priest must marry before ordination. After ordination, the window is closed and stays closed. A single man ordained to the priesthood cannot subsequently take a wife, and if his wife dies, he does not remarry. He continues as a widower in celibacy, or he withdraws from active ministry. The Orthodox Church has generally grounded that in the same phrase we examined earlier, maius gynaikos andra. Read in its strictest sense, one marriage for the man who serves. Bishops are celibate, drawn as a rule from the monastic ranks. A widowed priest can become a bishop by taking monastic vows, and there are canonized examples, including St. Innocent of Alaska. It is rare, there has been movement. In 2018, the Ecumenical Patriarchate issued an act of economia, pastoral exception, permitting remarriage for clergy in limited circumstances, principally those widowed or abandoned. It was and remains controversial. It is not universally received across the Orthodox world, and I would label it as contested rather than settled. The wife, meanwhile, is not incidental. She holds a title in her own right, presbytera in Greek usage, matushka in Russian, kuria in Arabic, and in a healthy parish, she is a public figure with real pastoral standing. That is one of the strongest arguments for the Eastern arrangement, and it is rarely made in the abstract debates about vocation numbers. Now the other correction, and this one surprises people more. There are married Roman Catholic priests, right now, in the Latin Church. In 1980, John Paul II approved what became known as the pastoral provision, allowing married former Anglican and Episcopal clergy to be ordained as Catholic priests with a dispensation from the celibacy requirement. More than 100 men have been ordained under it. Pius XII had made similar exceptions for some married Lutheran converts after the Second World War, and there were later cases involving Presbyterian and Methodist ministers. Benedict XVI widened the door in 2009 with Anglicanorum Coetibus, which created personal ordinariates, jurisdictions for former Anglicans keeping elements of their liturgical inheritance. 3 exist in England and Wales, the United States and Australia. The limits are instructive. A married convert clergyman may be ordained, he may not remarry if widowed. And a young man raised in one of those ordinariate parishes who feels called to the priesthood must still be celibate. The exception is personal, not structural. It transfers to no one. Then there are the Eastern Catholic churches, in full communion with Rome, under the Pope with married priests. Melkite, Ukrainian Greek, Ruthenian, Romanian and others, which produced one of the most consequential and least taught episodes in American religious history. In November of 1889, a Greek Catholic priest named Alexis Toth arrived in Minneapolis to serve Russian immigrants. He was a canon lawyer, fluent in several languages, and a widower. His wife and their only child had died years earlier. In December he presented his credentials to the local Roman Catholic ordinary, Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, as canon law required. Ireland, who lived from 1838 to 1918, was a leading figure in the movement to Americanize the immigrant church. By Toth's own account, Ireland's hands shook when he read the word uniate. He asked whether Toth had a wife. Toth said he was a widower. Ireland threw the papers down and said he had already written to Rome protesting against being sent this kind of priest. Ireland refused to recognize him and forbade him to function anywhere in the diocese. On the 25th of March 1891, Alexis Toth and 361 of his parishioners were received into the Russian Orthodox Church. Over the following years, tens of thousands of Eastern Catholic immigrants followed. Toth died in 1909 and was canonized in 1994 as Saint Alexis of Wilkes-Barre. The institutional response hardened rather than softened. In 1890, Rome forbade married Ruthenian priests from residing in the United States. In 1929, a decree known as Cum Data Furit extended the prohibition across North America, South America, and Australia. A group led by Metropolitan Orestes Chornock left and was received into Orthodoxy by Constantinople in 1938, becoming what is now the American Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese. Here is the detail that should stop you. When Rome finally rescinded the ban, in a decree signed by Cardinal Leonardo Sandri on the 14th of June 2014, the decree itself noted that an estimated 200,000 Ruthenian faithful had become Orthodox in the aftermath of the 1929 prohibition. That is my fifth opinion, and I hold it without hedging. The American celibacy wars cost the Catholic Church more people than most of the theological arguments it was having at the same time, and almost nobody teaches them. A discipline defended as a sign of undivided love was enforced in a way that divided hundreds of thousands of families from their church. That is worth sitting with regardless of where you stand on the underlying question. Which leaves the present, where the ground is still moving. The Second Vatican Council addressed priestly celibacy in 1965, and Paul VI issued a full encyclical on it, Sacerdotalis Celibatus, in June of 1967. Both affirmed the discipline. Both acknowledged, because it is not seriously deniable, that it is a discipline and not a doctrine, a law of the Church, not a truth revealed. Francis said the same in plainer language. What the Church has bound, the Church can loose. In October of 2019, the Synod of Bishops for the Amazon voted 128 to 41 to permit the ordination of suitable married men in remote regions, where communities can go months or years without the Eucharist. In February of 2020, in Querida, Amazonia, Francis simply did not take it up. He later explained that the Synod had produced a good argument, but not, in his judgment, a real discernment. In June of 2025, Leo XIV addressed roughly 400 bishops and cardinals in St. Peter's Basilica and affirmed the celibate priesthood, telling the bishops they must remain celibate and present the authentic image of the Church. And in March of 2026, Johann Boni, the Bishop of Antwerp, published an open letter to his people, saying he would make every effort to ordain married men within 2 years, and that the question is no longer whether the Church can do this, but when and who. Whether that goes anywhere, I do not know. By the time you watch this, it may have moved. Check the date on anything you read about it. So step back and look at the shape of the whole thing. 2 churches, One inheritance, 1700 years of argument. The East solved the problem by keeping the wife and restoring the rhythm. Abstinence at the altar, ordinary life away from it, and paid for that solution in the currency of its bishops, who surrender marriage entirely, and its widowers, who are told they may not love twice. The West solved the problem by keeping the rhythm and losing the wife, and paid for that solution in vocations in the wreckage of the American immigrant churches, and in the awkward existence of a rule that has, for 4 decades, been quietly waived for a specific category of converts while binding everyone else absolutely. Neither church preserved the 4th century intact. Both tell themselves they did, and underneath every canon, every synod, every decretal, every angry letter from a Spanish bishop about priests with newborn children, the question has never really changed. It is the question of what a man is permitted to carry with him when he walks up to a table where Christians of every tradition confess heaven and earth are supposed to meet. Whether the answer is everything or nothing or something in between, the Church has spent 2,000 years insisting that the answer matters, that the body of the man at the altar is not irrelevant to what happens on it, that there is a relationship, however contested, between how a priest lives and what a priest handles. You may think that logic is holy. You may think it is a leftover from the temple that the cross should have retired. Both of those are defensible positions, and both have been held by people far holier than me. But do not let anyone tell you the disagreement is simple, or recent, or reducible to money. The argument was never about marriage. It was about the marriage bed. If you were handed one of the 2 easy versions of this story, that Rome invented celibacy to protect its land, or that the East simply kept what the apostles gave, I would like to know which one, and who gave it to you. Leave it below. And if you have a priest's wife in your life, a presbytera or a matushka or a curia, tell me what her role in your parish actually looks like. There is a whole episode waiting in what happened to the wives, and I would rather build it out of your stories than out of canons.